Here we go with our first case, Prochnow versus Prochnow, a case in the Wisconsin Supreme Court. The facts before us are the parties, Joyce, who's the plaintiff, the wife, and Robert, the defendant, the so-called father of David. So what we know from the written opinion is that the couple married in September 2nd of 1950. And there was one child whose paternity is in question. On February of 1953, Robert began his military service. After about 6 months, no sexual intercourse except for one time happened in March of 1954. Joyce went on dates with Andy while husband was away, and she ended up getting pregnant. She had her child on November 21st, 1954. In between the time where she had the baby and Robert was in the military service, Robert still in letters claimed the child as his own. There were also 2 blood tests that eliminated Robert as a father. So what the issue before the court is the paternity of the child born to Joyce while he was married to Robert. In essence, whether the child born to Joyce was Robert's child. In cases like the Prochnow case, because there are dates that are important and relevant to the outcome of the case, I would recommend that you create a timeline, such as the one that you see on here. Again, September 2nd, 1950, married. February 1953, so 2 years, a little over years, Robert left to the military. In 1953, we learned that the wife, Joyce, began to having a lack of appreciation for her husband and had no sexual intimacy. She saw him on October for 8 days, on December for 10 days, and then the following year, on March 13, was a time when she had sexual relations with him, one time. And not too soon after, on April 18th, she ended up serving him with divorce, and 7 months later, almost 8 months later, a child was born. So the question in this timeline is, when did the wife get pregnant? Is it possible that Robert is the father by just looking at the timeline? That's a good question, right? So keep those in mind. Okay, now we go to the rule. So we have established the facts per the court. We discussed the issue. Now the rule that applies in this case. There's a couple things. Whenever it's established in an action or a proceeding that a child was born to a woman while she was the lawful wife of a specified man, any party asserting the illegitimacy of the child in such action or proceeding shall have the burden of proving beyond all reasonable doubt that the husband was not the father of the child. So the question is, who has the burden of proof? So Robert is the one claiming illegitimacy of the child while he was still married to Joy. So therefore, he has the burden of proof, and the burden of proof must be met by showing that beyond all reasonable doubt, he is not the father of the child. The other rule that is in play, but as we see by the outcome of the opinion, is not given much validity, is the blood test statute. It is determined that it's not conclusive, but the blood test results can be considered as part of the record. In the analysis of the opinion, the judge claims that the intercourse that happened on that one day between the couple at the time would be appropriate to conceive a child. So it is possible that a woman could have a baby and be pregnant for 8 months. Also, the court points to Robert's letters acknowledging that the child was his son. And the court accepts the wife's denial of having intercourse with Andy during the period of time that she could have conceived a child. So the court accepts her testimony as true. Even though her conduct with Andy may have been indiscreet, it falls short of adultery, according to the court. The court also claims that Robert did not assert Andy to be the father. And while the 8-month pregnancy may be unusual, it's not enough to dispute the paternity, again because the burden of proof was so high. Robert had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he wasn't the father. In the state of Wisconsin, blood tests are not final. And in this instance, Joy's testimony outweighed the blood test. Aside from the blood test, the facts that were presented by Robert do not prove beyond a reasonable doubt. Thus, the court ends up concluding that Robert is the father of Joy's child. I know what you may be thinking. How could this have happened? Well, if you think about when the case was decided back in 1957, science may have been much newer than today. Now we have over 70 years of tested science. So the test on the blood types was not conclusive at that point by state statute. And that was the law in Wisconsin. And so it was argued by the court, or reasoned by the court, that therefore could only be taken into account, but not the final determiner for the outcome of this case.